Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Captains of the Industry. I am Lubabalo Mashiqana, and my guest today is the Executive Director and Founder of the Dalbert Group, James Mwangi. James, thank you so much for your time and thanks for joining us. Just take us through a brief overview of your early years in business.
Goodness, yes. First of all, it's a pleasure to be on the show. I started my career, I grew up in East Africa, had the chance to go to the United States for my higher education, and started my career as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company in their New York office. And within a year or two, felt like there was something missing. And this was around the time, and maybe this is dating me a little bit, around the time of the 9/11 attacks. And wondering what was the role of business or business skills in responding to the challenges that had been revealed in that in terms of a very divided and unequal world. And so I left that job to join two friends who were launching a new firm called Dalbert that aimed to bring the tools of private sector and industry to tackling the questions of international development and growth.
Some of the challenges that you faced moving up the ladder?
Well, when you're growing up in and with a startup, it's a little bit different in some ways than being in a large corporate, because I think there are challenges of just trying to build the business, explaining what this unknown little outfit you're representing is and why anyone should hire you. And then in addition to that, then building credibility and a presence. And to be clear, I spent the first 5 or 6 years of my career working in the United States and traveling around. And as a young African walking into the room and saying to a whole range of people, you should listen to me, not because I have the skills and I have the perspective that you need. So I think there were those two things, building my own voice and a comfort in my own voice, but at the same time, just struggling with what any small business struggles with, proving that you can deliver on time, on scope, and on budget.
Just some milestones that you've reached so far as a businessman.
Well, I think what I'm proudest of, I think I'd have to start with, moving from New York to start Dalbert's offices in Africa, starting in Johannesburg in 2007 was a big one, in part because Africa now is almost, actually probably more than half of Dalbert's work globally, which no one really expected at the time we did that. We really started from scratch. I think taking over the role of managing partner and actually being CEO of our core business at the time for a number of years was interesting. No one thought that you could do that from Africa. I remember people always asking me, so you head the Johannesburg office or the Africa unit? And I'd be, no, I lead the firm globally. And it was an interesting message and an inversion. And I think more recently, making that transition and convincing people that we are no longer just what they've always known us to do, which is just an advisory firm. We're adding all these other capabilities and we're building a culture around being a collection of businesses rather than just one particular line. So at each one of those, I think it's required a little bit of a push, a little bit of a change in my own mindset. But again, I come back to that first one, jumping away from the established mothership and starting with a phone, a desk, and 2 people in Johannesburg in 2007. I think that really started me off on my next stage as a leader.
Just the company's developments from then until now?
Well, like I said, we started off as 3 people back when I joined. By 2007, we had, again, 2 or 3 people in Africa. Today, we have 10 offices in Africa, 23 globally. We employ about 500 professionals. Working across strategy advisory, human-centered design, capital and investment advisory, data and analytics, and primary research, as well as areas of implementation and media and communication. So really a range of things ranging from ex-journalists to data scientists to designers to typical consultants, all kind of pushing towards a new approach to inclusive business around the world.
African economies have been facing several challenges over the past years. You'd know that when you started your business, it was the year before the big challenge. How did you overcome that, and how have you managed to actually stay and grow within those stringent could I say, conditions?
Well, the interesting thing we have found is because from the beginning we said we would be purpose first, so we would always look at the areas where we could have the most impact, where we could contribute most to inclusive and sustainable growth. We actually always encountered a shortage of capacity to tackle all the opportunity we saw. And we like to say, you know, we've been around through multiple downturns and contractions. We have continued to grow pretty consistently in Africa and around the world every year, in part because the kind of work we focus on ends up being relatively non-cyclical. There's always work to be done. In a contraction, it's figuring out how to continue to deliver services and goods to people. In an expansion, it's seizing new opportunities. And finally, we're still so small compared to the need out there that it's going to be a while before the external market conditions really are a limit to where we think we can go. So we've been fortunate in that way.
Growing your company's market share, take us through that.
So that's an interesting question of market share, because that would require us to identify one market and say that's the one we're sharing with others. And for a long time, we did think of ourselves as a strategy firm competing with the likes of some of the firms we had hired some of our early members from, your McKinseys, your BCGs, Bains, etc. But I think over time, and in that regard, I think we've done reasonably well. I think, you know, our footprint in Africa in particular is the largest of any major kind of strategy and professional services firm, with 10 locations. So we're able to provide homegrown advice versus having to fly people in and out of a range of places. But I think what we've tried to do is say, actually, we are something different entirely. We're not just an advisory firm. We're not defined by the tools or techniques we bring to our clients. We're defined by the purpose for which we engage, which is contributing to inclusive and sustainable growth and being a partner in that journey with a whole range of other actors. And that means that, in a sense, we're inventing a category. We're coming in and saying, let's build an initiative together with a large business. Let's help a government shape a new department in a way that we don't think lots of other people do. And so, again, to my earlier point, we feel like we've got a lot of ocean all to ourselves.
Bridging the gap?
Between,
you'd see that many businesses, especially that have expanded throughout Africa, there is a gap in there in terms of skills development when you're actually looking at employment, and in terms of economies as well, moving from skills development in terms of also adapting in various economies. Right.
I think that's one of the areas where we've taken a slightly different approach than a lot of businesses. If you're going to say that we are, you know, there was a time when we could have said we were an American business because that's where we started, or we were a Danish business because the initial founder was Danish, or we were South African because we started in South Africa and so on, or Kenyan because I and the largest pool of our team now sits in Nairobi in Kenya. Instead, what we've tried to do is be localized everywhere we are, and bring a global and a local perspective combined. So in a typical office is about 60% local, 40% international. And that creates a very interesting opportunity, because the thing is, talent is evenly distributed in the human population. And what we're finding is, once you peel away the question of, oh, you need to talk with a particular accent or have gone to a particular school, everyone needs to learn something when they start a job. And so whether it is our colleagues that we hire in New York or Copenhagen or London needing to learn about some of the realities of frontier and emerging markets, or how to connect in a particular way in particular settings, or some of our colleagues in Dakar or Conakry or Lagos having to pick up some aspects of how the international economy is structured, everyone is learning, and they're learning from each other. And so you create this rich ecosystem where actually each person you add, so long as you maintain a high bar for basic quality, and this is not about the accent you speak in or the school that gave you a degree, it's how you perform on some very measurable tasks, you find that actually each person you add enriches you and makes you more grounded in the place that they're coming from. So we want to be as much an Ethiopian company or as Rwandan a company as we are an Indian company or a Singaporean company. Because in each of those places, we have people from those places as the core of what we're building.
Taking me to my next question, expanding your company's influence in and beyond your sector. Take us through that.
Well, in a sense, we began by defining ourselves as being a consulting firm for the development sector. Increasingly, we view ourselves as a platform or group of businesses looking to change the very fundamental way in which business is done, or in the way that business, government, and the social sector tackle problems. And that means we don't actually recognize the boundaries of sector. We try to engage in a range of spaces. What we found is this notion of, the thing that we are passionate about is this notion of shared value, this notion of a shared compact to improve society. And we're finding that that is becoming more and more current in the conversations that we have, whether it is government leaders who finally are trying to speak the language of business and try to attract investment and so on, focus on efficiency in delivery. Whether it is with CEOs who are actually saying, well, if I'm trying to do well in Africa or in a country like Myanmar or wherever, I am going to need to understand the basics of the social challenges facing people in that context. And that means I need to be thinking almost like a social sector worker or a public sector worker. Or if you're a foundation, actually saying, you know what, we have a lot of money, but compared to the problems we're trying to solve, it's not a lot. And so we're going to need to think about leverage, how we influence business and government, or how we build new partnerships together. So in a way, we break out of this notion that we do development projects or we work in one or another sector by actually changing the mindset to say what we do is we hopefully help anchor new and innovative partnerships. And that can be as different as transforming the way surgery is done to improve safety and security, which we're doing through our Safe Surgery 2020 initiative, bringing technology to agriculture through platforms like DigiFarm in collaboration with Safaricom and Mercy Corps, and so many other of these types of interventions in so many sectors.
Let's put a pause on things right there. We're still with James Mwangi, the Executive Director of the Dalbert Group. We've got more captains of the industry right after this break. You're still watching Captains of the Industry with myself, Lubabalo Mashikanda, and our guest, of course, James Mwangi, is going to tell us more now about his business and also delve more into the matter of shared value. James, again, well, thank you. You touched on an important factor before we went into a break of shared value. Let's delve more on that, on how do you think that can actually make doing business in Africa easier?
Well, I think we need to begin by asking what is the purpose of business, right? Until very recently, the whole idea was your job was to solve problems in society and in doing so generate a profit and generate good livelihoods for your workers, etc. So returns to shareholders, benefits to society, and benefits to your workers. Somewhere over the last 40 or 50 years, we've lost our way, and the shareholders' interest has become the only one that matters in some way. And I think particularly, in some ways, that's something that you can maybe get away with for a while in an established and well-functioning market economy that's already relatively well off, although even there it breaks down eventually. But in a place like Africa, where so many needs need to be met, and so much still needs to be built in conjunction with society, if you come in always looking for short-term shareholder interest, you can't build anything. You're stuck figuring out what are the few products that have been developed for an advanced middle class in some other part of the world that I can maybe cut the price off to deliver to someone here, instead of actually saying, here is almost 1 billion people who have so many needs, so much untapped potential, both to create and deliver on their own. How can I unlock that? How can I bring them something that they're looking for and tap them for something? And I think what's lacking in Africa today is enough businesses that come to the table not saying, here are all of the things I need in order to build a business that I don't have in Africa, and instead ask, here are all the things that Africa needs that I as a business can deliver. And that I can deliver in a way that is both good for my business, good for my workers, and good for society.
How do we assist companies, James, in terms of understanding the point that you're trying to make of that here are those things that Africa needs that I can provide as a business?
Well, ultimately, I think the numbers have to talk for themselves. And one of the things I find really exciting, and I think we've seen it in our work at Dalbert, is we push this notion of a holistic engagement of business wherever we engage with companies. In Africa, actually, is where we find the greatest interest in it, because you are seeing many of the most successful companies. I come from Kenya, I live in Kenya now, and if you think about who are the most successful companies in Kenya, they drag their experience and their proven track record drags everyone else to say, we also have to think about this. We also have to put this at the center of how we're thinking about things and how we're approaching issues. And not just because we want to inspire ourselves and our workers, but because we're seeing the bottom line impact from our competitors. So I think it's easier here because the loop between thinking in shared value terms and generating greater profits is shorter and tighter. And you can actually see the link between companies that think that way and companies that perform well in their markets.
The major drivers of success for your company now moving forward, James?
I think I would say two things are really at the heart of how we're thinking about things at Dalbert. One is really diversifying the ways in which we're able to engage and bring value to clients and partners, etc. So, for example, really moving data and the insights of data to the heart of everything that we do. We've invested heavily in data analytics capabilities, in primary research capabilities, basically saying that decision makers in every other part of the world often have up to the minute insight into the markets or issues they're trying to make decisions on. In Africa, we're often relying on 10 years old census data that wasn't particularly accurate on the day it was produced. We need to address that. We need to address that by making investments in gathering data and also being better at analyzing what we've got. So we're actually making decisions based on what we know, not just what we guess or what we've been told. The other thing we're trying to do is really embed in deep personal insight. So actually meeting people where they are, understanding their context, the tools of human-centered design and engagement. And then finally saying, I think the era in which you sold an answer to someone as an advisor and they took it and they implemented it and they gave you a check, that era is over. It's been clear for a while that it is over. You actually need to be a partner in delivering results. And if that means deploying a team alongside your partners to actually get the thing done, to build the initiative, to launch the institution, then so be it. And so really reinventing ourselves to be an implementational partner on the journey with our clients. Maybe the last thing I'll say in this regard is we are also pushing ourselves to really embrace our entrepreneurial heritage and say over the last decade and a half, we've gotten very good at meeting our clients' demands, but we've also gotten quite good at starting new things, whether it's a new office or a new business. We want to keep both of those strands alive and well as we enter our next decade of growth and keep on launching new things, keep on innovating, keep on developing new frontiers.
Leadership challenges that you have actually identified within your sector and as well within the broader business space?
So I think one of the most interesting things that we've really invested in is a commitment to diversity. So as I said before, we employ about 500 people around the world. Half of them are women. We employ people from every ethnicity, every orientation, every creed, every color, right? On one level, that makes us a tremendously robust organization. At any given table, you can, if you ask how many languages are spoken at this table within Dalbert, chances are more than 10, right? It allows you to bring different perspectives to bear on a problem and to really knock it out. So groupthink becomes very, very difficult. And that's exciting. It allows us to really to think outside the box. But it also demands a lot of leaders, because a lot of received wisdom around leadership assumes everyone is coming from the same place, in a sense. And when they're not, a lot of things that you take for granted become difficult and demanding. They demand a self-consciousness and a self-awareness. And so all of our leaders within Dalbert are continually on this journey of really understanding themselves and the people that they lead, and recognizing that sometimes diversity is uncomfortable. And it's that discomfort that allows you to generate excellence. So to me, the biggest challenge that we face, but I think also the biggest opportunity, is navigating the discomforts and the energy that comes from truly embracing diversity.
Let's talk innovation, James, in the sector that you are driving at this point, and also in terms of a broader general view on how we tackle this.
So I think, to my mind, innovation really comes back to a point, a couple of things that are really the building blocks in my mind. The first of this is you really need to have contextual understanding. You need to meet people where they are. And too much of the thinking that we see around tapping market opportunities in Africa, for example, is done from shiny boardrooms in capital cities. And not enough time just sitting in the village and seeing how 80% of the people in the continent, whether in the village or in the informal settlement in a city, how 80% of the people on the continent are actually living, what they're prioritizing, how they're making decisions. And so that contextual grounding is something we're really investing in. It comes together with that point I made earlier around diversity. You actually need people who are not just tourists coming to see how people are living, but are actually from those settings, have come up from those contexts and can say, here is how my grandmother or my parents or my brothers and sisters are making decisions. So that's one thing that really feeds into innovation. The next thing is, if you're trying to really scale, you really need to start embracing the power of data, starting to build those data assets. And Africa is really struggling with data poverty, and unless we solve that, we will be forever behind everyone else. And I think the third thing is this comfort in working across, the three sectors, if you will, the social sector, government, and business, and recognizing that very often the answer to a problem in any one of those sectors lies in insights coming from another one of them. And so we take those three things. We keep a very diverse team. We really ground ourselves in both on-the-ground insights and data, and then we try and engage with players across business, government, and civil society to then say, here are solutions that hopefully kind of stretch the envelope and push us in a direction of progress.
You spoke about something very interesting in there that my producer actually put to me, of the challenge of failure of shared value in the African continent. Take us through that.
Well, I think I'll come back to a point we discussed earlier, which is, I think you look around Africa and you can either see a litany of reasons why business cannot succeed, which I would understand from a business person looking from their context outside of Africa and saying, well, all of the things I'm used to in Japan or in China or in the United States, many of those things are not yet available here. It's going to be very difficult to do business here. I could almost understand that. But I think our business leaders on the continent forget to look at their context and say, here's the wealth of opportunity to unlock potential that I can see that others cannot. Unfortunately, I think we had, and I think it's changing, but I think a lot of business leaders have fallen into a pattern of conventional wisdom that says, actually, hedge, focus on the known, and treat the unknown as, build walls to keep some of the things you don't understand or the things that aren't working out of your business. And that means you have these tiny islands of prosperity across Africa. To me, that's a failure of imagination, right? We'll soon have the world's biggest workforce. There's so many dimensions on which Africa could be an engine of global wealth generation. And instead of racing to claim the commanding heights of that future economy, I think still too many of our business leaders are worried that what little they are operating today will not quite, chug along. So that's it. And maybe the other side of it is saying, to do that well, you need to be really committed to solving the problems of society. You can't just be looking to make a quick buck. You need to be asking yourself, why is it that this country here or this community or this city is not functioning? And now let me try and solve that, rather than let me try and sell this one product for as much as I can. And I think once you take that broad view, the opportunity becomes obvious. It's when you narrow down too narrowly to say, well, I make widgets and only widgets will do, that you really struggle, because maybe you're making the wrong thing and you just need to change what you do a little bit and you'll unlock the opportunity.
Thanks so much, James. And that is where we leave it for this week's edition of the Captains of Industry. And well, of course, we were speaking to James Mwangi, the Executive Director and founder of the Dalbert Group. From me and the team, it's goodbye for now.